Hello, my name is Dr. Gregory Seltz. I'm the Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. Welcome to our Liberty Alert Live. Today we are going to talk about morality and virtue, the two kingdom citizens' opportunity to culturally rebuild what has been destroyed. I would say, honestly, looking at what's going on in politics today, what is continually being destroyed. Now, some people think it should be. So, again, I'm at this point, I'm just talking about the reality of what is. There's a great book that I have been reading. It's called Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American American Culture by Anthony Esselin. And again, when we start talking about rebuilding culture, people say, well, what's our role? And it's not our role to rebuild culture. Well, it's our role to engage culture and to talk about the God who orders culture, the God who created us, and the God who ordered us for the sake of culture, because things can get much worse. And so to that degree, we're going to talk today, and I think for the next several months, we're going to talk today about morality, virtue, the two kingdom citizens' opportunity to actually engage these things. And I want to start off by looking at the opening of the 117th Congress and how the House opened this. And I think we can expect more of this in the days to come. The issues of gender, personal pronouns, and policy, and how that affects. Again, when you have a limited government, then that stuff, it doesn't affect us much because the government is basically limited to very specific things. But when the government is all-inclusive, this kind of changing of the language and demanding and coercing language and stuff like that, it begins to be very, very nefarious in how we can actually be the church. Deconstruction, now that I know when you look at what's happening in university, the concept of deconstructing everything, it really tear everything down. In the hands, it's not a virtue, because it's easy to destroy. And especially in the hands, even of Christians, if we use the law just to destroy, it can be done. Yeah, it's easy to do that. But the goal is also, what are you reconstructing? And again, I don't see a lot of people talking about reconstruction. It's deconstruct, 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 and then the answer is coerce this person to do that or coerce this person to do that. No, free people, serving one another. That's finally the ultimate challenge for the culture in which we live. And so morality and virtue, we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but in the days to come, this is not demanding that the government be moral and virtuous and actually limited is not something, we share that with other religious worldviews as well. We're not demanding that people be Christian. What we're saying is that there's a moral, virtuous way of approaching these kinds of things that we share in common with others too, and we want to defend that for the sake of our culture. Thanks for listening in. I think it's a dynamic opportunity to be who we are in Christ, but it is going to be more punitive, like we've said. We've talked about the agendas. We've talked about what's on each person's agenda, what's on their platforms. I'm not so worried about personalities, but what people are actually doing, and we'll start to actually see that in the coming weeks now, because the kind of a secular progressive agenda, it's 50-50 in the House, but of course that means that one side can enforce its will. And 50-50 in the Senate. And the House the majority has shrunk, and there are a lot of people who are saying we weren't ready for this kind of secular, progressive, even anti-religious tone to things. We'll see how that works out going forward. But thanks for listening, and again, we're here for you. And the goal for all this for me, whatever your politics, I'm more concerned about what is this going to mean for the church, for the schools, for our preschools, our universities. Can we preach the whole counsel of God? Can we actually do that without government coercion and without fear? We're going to see. So Happy New Year, Happy New Year. So I just got back from Washington, D.C., and it's amazing. It's still shut down. It's unbelievable. But my daughter and her husband consecrated their wedding vows, their wedding in a private ceremony in Washington on New Year's Eve. So amidst all the lockdowns, we celebrated a very special moment. And again, DC's on lockdown despite what's happening there today. despite what's happening. We'll see where this goes. I don't think the lockdown fever is over yet. Look what we've done to each other through this mask stuff, the fear that we've engendered. You know, I've flown on a couple of flights, and again, I know what the seriousness of COVID-19, but it is always amazing. Whatever you count is how you start to see things. We've had less overall deaths this year than last year. I think every year the number's around 3 million. We've had less than that this year, despite this pandemic. And 99.9% of people under 60 get it and get well. And yet, look what we've done. And look how we've now started to treat each other because of the mandates and the fear. It even changed our elections. It changed how we did our election. It changed all kinds of things. So again, we'll have a lot to talk about that going forward. And especially the religious liberty stuff with that. But it's about the church and what is happening to the church in the midst of this, and how can we be the church for the sake of culture and the mission. Our week in review, you know, again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. The COVID-19 bill, my biggest issue with this is, again, they make it sound like they're giving us money, and they're not. They're giving you your money. This is our money. They collect our taxes and they give it back. And so now the question was $600 versus $2,000. And then the bill was loaded with all kinds of pork. And so President Trump, I think he kind of made a mistake because he played kind of into the hands of people who disagree with him. But he did say, get rid of the pork, you know, and create a free internet. And all those things are important. And then he said, and when you get rid of all that pork, give the American people relief, because they're the ones that were hurting. It's all well and good, but if you can't enforce that, and he couldn't, then all the opposition did is said, yeah, give the American, so keep the pork, keep the internet in the hands of a few, and give people more money. Well, you can never outgive people who think the government's job is to give you stuff. So I don't think that was necessarily, it didn't play out well, but listen, you know, I just say, if you think that you got that for free, I can tell you right now, they're going to tax it back from you pretty soon. So I don't know, put it in a lockbox, because they'll be coming back for that soon. I lived in New York and in Los Angeles. I've lived in places where the taxes are outrageous. And there's never an end to this. I mean, I remember when I kept saying, why is gas so expensive out in LA? It's because of the way they put regulations on the refiners and all these different kind of things. And then they add 70 cents a gallon. I think it's even more than that now. Plus, you know, a personal tax on your stuff you buy, all this kind of stuff, just to actually live there. And then they also tax your property as well. And then, of course, the schools get that money whether they provide the services for you or not. They always have your money first. If you've ever worked with a contractor, do you ever pay the contractor before they actually do the work for you? And yet, when it comes to these kind of services, they take those things and then they determine what they're going to give and what they're not going to give. So again, I just look at this and I think to myself, why would we think this is a good idea? And why are we getting used to settling for the crumbs that come from a government that is intrusively involved in virtually every aspect of our life? You know, even here in Missouri, you know, you think this through. In Detroit, when I grew up in Detroit, I'll go back to Detroit first. I saw what happened to my city when the politics started kind of sucking the city dry. And I remember looking at people, this is black and white, in the city, who their goal was to work for the car companies and to buy their houses and to retire in their homes. Well, once they gutted, you know, the industry in the city from a tax, all they had left was property taxes. And so people who had bought their homes, who were going to retire in their homes, now their homes weren't worth anything. They couldn't sell them, and the property taxes were outrageous. And so they lost their homes even after years and years and years of working hard. That to me is criminal. And then even in Missouri, I moved to Missouri, and this is a pretty conservative state in some ways. They have this thing called personal property tax. If you buy 2 cars at $30,000 each, which I think is about an average car now, right? I try not to spend that much. I bought mostly used cars, that's a long story. But 2 $30,000 cars, I think you're paying about $1,500 a year in personal property tax just to get your car on the road and to get yourself a license plate. I think that's outrageous. You could actually own your car and then lose it to the fact that you can't pay your tax bill. So again, when we start to think the idea, I've also heard that they're now considering, taxing Social Security and taxing your 401ks because we always need more and more resources. So again, this government giving us back things, no. I think Trump originally wanted to just say the withholdings that you usually send to us, don't do it, just keep it for yourself. I thought that would have been a much better way to do this thing because it was money we had earned, it was money you had earned, and it was money that you could now use to provide for your family. Yesterday there was an election. Today there's also a protest. We're not going to talk too much about the election today. It's going to take us some time to kind of see what this is all about. But we did elect basically a secular progressive and then a black liberation theologian progressive. And my whole thesis was in James Cone. This is a James Cone disciple. Some say he's, anyway, I know what they mean by the terminology, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out because religion and politics is going to be wedded together like never before. And for those of you who say the religious right is too political and they politicize the gospel, you ain't seen nothing yet. And the question is, what is that doing to the proclamation of the gospel and the church? And how can we actually use some of these legitimate concerns that are being raised? And we've talked about the legitimate concerns. In fact, even my discussion with Cone, Cone had a righteous anger in what was going on with black people politically in our culture. I think, the fact that, FDR, I don't know how he gets away with this. FDR actually wedded black folks to the Democratic Party because up till that point they had voted Republican because Republicans were the party of anti-racism and anti-slavery. He wedded a lot of people, white and black, to the government through Social Security, and now that's bankrupt, by the way, and that's a Ponzi scheme now because the government has spent our money. And pretty soon that we're going to have to see how that's going to work because that's going to be an unfunded mandate that's going to have to be funded or it's going to just run out of cash. Well, it already has. And then the same thing, suddenly overnight the Faustian deal was that he said government will be more of an assistance to African Americans. And yet FDR was one of the most racist presidents, Woodrow Wilson, one of the most racist presidents we've ever had. LBJ, one of the most racist presidents we've ever had. These were all Democrats, these were all progressives, these were all people who utilized government to keep people in their place. And I always went back to the story of what FDR did to Jesse Owens. And the narrative is that Jesse Owens went and undermined Hitler's white supremacy and all this kind of stuff. That did not happen. The stadium where Jesse Owens competed was cheering his name. That's what actually happened. And Hitler at the time wasn't making a big deal of the politics of all this kind of stuff. Anyway, he did eventually not greet all the people, but that was because he would have then had to greet everybody. But nonetheless, and then even one of the German competitors, if you look back on this, in the long jump, he actually helped Jesse Owens because Owens could have fouled a third time and been out of the contest. And so the German competitor said, you need to change your steps because you don't even have to try hard to qualify, so change your steps and make sure you qualify. And so he helped them do that, and it allowed Owens to qualify, and then of course it was a great back and forth between the two of them. And Jesse Owens was one and this guy was number two. They had a lifelong friendship in the competition. So where did this narrative come from? Well, it was to cover up the fact that when Jesse Owens came back, FDR did not invite him to the White House. He invited every other champion. He did not invite Jesse Owens, not even a telegram. And Owens, in his own biography, said, the one who rejected me was my own president. He was the one who segregated the military again, all this kind of stuff. Again, I don't mind looking back on these things and talking about these things, but let's not give credit where credit isn't due. And let's look at what politics actually can do for us and what it cannot do. And then let's find a way to do it together ourselves. So that's going to be a lot to talk about in the coming weeks, but there was that election, and that election is going to challenge a lot of our work as a church. And one of the things that I think is very difficult is because a lot of the social progressives today use biblical language but they don't mean the same thing as what the church means by those things. So Happy New Year. We'll see what's going on in the days and weeks to come. The two folks that were voted in yesterday, are letting us know that they're going to do it for our good. But again, who determines what we mean by those words? So many today are talking about how the government can solve a lot of our problems. What I keep saying to you in this, and especially as the church, as we get involved in these things, what are the solutions? What are the solutions that the church can provide? What are the solutions that the government can provide? What happens when the government starts providing the solutions that only the church can provide? And what happens when the government starts taking over some of these roles where they don't belong? For those who keep saying they're going to be such great things that are going to happen now, I say, well, then if that's the case, why are they closing down charter schools, home schools, and parental choice? If they're for the poor, these are some of the greatest things you can give: a good education, opportunity for education. These are the things that they're saying they're going to close down. Why are we still advocating policies that are destroying the family? Why are we doing that? And then why are they using the idea of what is family to close down Christian involvement with foster cares, adoption agencies, and other church community services? Those are going to be the kind of questions that we're going to have to answer going forward. So today, Happy New Year. We'll see what comes up in the next new year, and we will try to be two kingdom citizens who engage these things for the sake of the culture. I mean, we have a cultural role to play, and we're to be a moral voice in the culture in which we live. But our main work is to bring people to a real repentance and a sense of wholeness that only comes in Jesus Christ, our identity in Him as being created and redeemed by Him. Where are we today? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. We'll see. And again, as a pastor, I know where I am because of who Christ is, and I know where I am because of what Christ says about me and what Christ says about you and me. But where is our culture? That's a tougher one to say at this point. I hearken back to Exodus chapter 1, where it talks about, the children of Israel were brought into Egypt under Joseph and the issues with Joseph. And it was for their protection, and they found a partnership. They actually created a partnership of mutual benevolence, if you will, with the children of Israel and the Egyptians. Well, then it says in Exodus chapter 1, there arose a king who knew not Joseph. And I think we're in a moment kind of like that. The Christian worldview has been a blessing in the West, long before there was an America. It's been a blessing. It got the culture, especially in the West, through the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages as they call them, and it allowed kind of a springing forth that created liberty in ways that were unknown in the world in which people lived. Luther, the clarity of the gospel, and then the purpose of the church and the state, even though it was still in kind of a feudalistic context, and how that finally came to fruition in individual liberty before the law. Wow, amazing stuff. But I think we're at a moment now where more and more leaders are arising who knew not Joseph. Now, as I've said before, the secular progressives that I've talked to you about, I know what their agenda is. I'm not so concerned about that. And they think their agenda is better than the Christian worldview. They believe that. They believe the church is a hindrance to the world in which they live. They think we've got to get beyond this. I understand that. They're very clear about that. I'm more concerned with Christians who don't realize that these secularists are increasingly determining not only what problems we solve, but how we solve these problems, what language we use, what solutions supposedly we use, and how the church is to be kind of pushed out of those discussions in the process. And I think that's what I want to talk to you about today, because the beginning of the 117th Congress was kind of a harbinger of what's to come. And it was, so basically Representative Emmanuel Cleaver, who is a pastor, he's a reverend, he talked about this prayer, and again, may the Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us his peace. And then he's talking about peace around the world, peace in this chamber. We ask this in the name of the monotheistic God. And I wonder why he said that. That's taking a stand. There's some people who don't believe in a monotheistic God. There's others who don't believe that there's any God at all. So why didn't he put all that in there? The name of the monotheistic God, Brahman and God, known by many names, by many different faiths. And then he said, Amen and All woman. He politicized the word Amen. And he made it so, I saw someone say, so if we say Hebrew, should we say Shebrew? I mean, we're at that point where now we're going to see everywhere places to deconstruct and destroy and bring tradition to its knees. What's interesting is I love this article in the Wall Street Journal where it says gender neutral language is more than a word game, and that's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm saying that if they start changing the language, if there's an all-inclusive government that's involved in every aspect of your life, it's going to start telling you what you can say and what you can't say. It might leave your home unchanged, but I think eventually it'll be in everything you say and in everything you do. And this writer, Jason Riley, said it this way. In 1946, Politics in the English Language, George Orwell wrote that political language consists largely of euphemism, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. I think he's absolutely right. They never say what they want to say. They never say what they truly mean. But they always say what they say so that they can garnish more power. That's the point. And later on he says that's the whole point of the gender neutral language. So we have this prayer where it says amen and a woman, and then they basically, in the first the 117th Congress, they threw out the words father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, uncle, and they replace them with parent, child, sibling, and so forth. The point is they're really obliterating the family as a unit. There is no such thing as father, mother anymore. There can be mother, mother. There can be father, father. There can be spouse, spouse. They're destroying that kind of language because they don't want you to look to the family for your provision. They don't want you to look to your family for the sake of your virtue. In fact, if you think about how they're setting all this stuff up, as soon as you have your child, they want you to turn that child over to a preschool, and they want the government to take care of that. Turn that child over to a school, they'll take care of that. Turn that child over to the high school, they'll take care of that. And then they'll indoctrinate and teach your child how to think through the things that they're supposed to think through. Well, that's not the purpose of the education system. It was supposed to undergird the parental role in raising up children in the way of the Lord. And so again, that's why we're fighting for educational freedom and parental choice. I don't have any problem with the fact that everyone should, in a country like ours, everyone should have access to a quality education. The question is, who determines that? Who owns that process? And right now, Planned Parenthood owns that. They're the ones funding the teachers' unions, and so is the homosexual lobby and those kind of things. Very, very powerful. I've talked to you about that book, Get Out Now, written by two educators in California. I understand we're giving our children over to all of these kinds of things, and then we're expecting them to come out believing in God, loving family, and loving our country. It's not going to happen. So, interestingly enough, he says the gender neutral language is more than a word game. You can't disagree, respectively. So it's another example. He says how the political left, I would call them the secular progressives, demand not only tolerance, but endorsement. You cannot respectfully disagree, let alone not agree at all. There will be consequences for that. So again, when we look at what's happening, what I'm saying is we're in this moment where we're actually changing the very language that we use to even dialogue with one another, and we're going to make it punitive for anyone who disagrees. So if you're a church who teaches you're created by God, and he created male and female, and he talked about the institution of family, and you start talking through that. In fact, I read something else this last weekend that said sex was not created for men and women, it was created for husbands and wives. That's the biblical notion of sex and intimacy. Leave his father and mother, cleave unto his wife, commit to one another, and then there's the intimacy of sexuality that comes from that. It's a beautiful thing. And you learn for the rest of your life to learn how to love somebody the way that God in Christ loves you. You won't be able to say that because it differentiates that way of thinking about marriage from the now cultural way of defining that. And since the government now is in all kinds of things, it's going to determine whether you can even say those things. So again, Jordan Peterson, he's a psychologist who's gotten involved in these kind of discussions, and everyone accuses him of being anti-gay and anti-transgender and anti-all this, and he's not. What he is against is the government telling him how he is supposed to talk and how he's not supposed to talk. And he talks about how he's never disrespected any of his students. In fact, he treats them with the utmost respect, as they should treat him as well. What he doesn't appreciate is when the government says, and this is how you will do that. And that's the same kind of issue we're talking about for the church. The church is going to be labeled all kinds of things. And we're one of the most tolerant groups in the sense that we all know we're sinners, so we're not intolerant of people because they're sinful or that they are broken, because we're just as broken. But we will not be dictated to how we will respond to that. We want to be faithful to the Word of God and faithful to the people God sends us. So we'll see. And these issues of gender, pronouns, and policy, I think it's more about destroying than building. I think everyone knows how to destroy. They know how to leverage power. That's what governments do. The question is, what can they build? I don't think they can rebuild what they destroy. We'll see. What's coming? I think Virginia is still our best guess because that's been going on in the state for about a year now, and we've already seen the punitive nature of these gender laws and all the gender pronoun discussions and transgender issues. We've already seen how it's attacking even the Title IX protections for women, because how can you have a Title IX protection for women if there's no such thing as woman? If there's no such thing as biological woman and biological man, then you can't differentiate, because all there is gender and all there is choice. And that's starting to work its way back and destroy the protections and the uniqueness that we provided for the differentiation and co-equality of women's issues, per se. Same thing's happening with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and all these different kind of things, because we don't have a baseline whatsoever except every individual person's choice. And in that sense, science is even being discarded completely. So, again, what I'm more concerned about is the kind of power that can be leveraged when the federal government gets involved in these things and doesn't allow us to be neighbors and citizens to one another, even though we might disagree. We had this happen to us when we were doing pro-life work in New York City. We worked with the Catholic Church in New York City. It was a great partnership. Life Journey Ministries, Cardinal O'Connor, and basically there were pro-life clinics around the city. And again, if a woman came in and wanted to bring a child to term, the support was there. They were actually supported all the way to the point of giving birth to that child. There was resourcing for that and all these things, and even if they kept the baby, So this idea that we didn't help and we didn't, care about the personal needs was just silly. But we were constantly under threats of litigation. And one time, one of our workers said she fell off a chair and she brought a suit that almost bankrupted one of our places. And we never even saw the person fall off the chair. It just was suddenly brought to us, and now there was a law firm that did it pro bono, and they could take us to court and they could endlessly sue us to the point where we finally had to settle, I think, for $75,000. I think that was almost all the money we had. And so when you think about what can happen in these pro bono things, or where government can kind of start to pressure people, it's going to be interesting, because that's what Virginia said. You could have a child who comes to school, suddenly says, the code is that girls dress with skirts, boys dress in shorts. He could suddenly say, I want to dress in a skirt. You say, no, you're a boy, you can't. Suddenly you'll have a lawsuit. Next thing you know, you'll be paying a $100,000 fine and damages. That's the kind of stuff that's coming. So we'll see. And again, I know if we put our covenants up front and say this is what we believe, teach and confess, and all those things, I know everyone says that will protect us. We'll see, because we now have a very aggressive government, and it's now being taken to the federal level. Okay? Now, again, like I've said before, I've tried to say I'm not shocked that the people who are secular progressive want to do these things. And they think that the best way to do it is to take control of government and enforce this new way of thinking about things. I'm not shocked by that, but I am shocked by Christians who think that somehow this isn't going to affect who we are or our ability to be who we are. Try to be a scientist who believes in creation. Try to get tenure at a secular university or a public university. Or even try to get your PhD through if they find out that you believe in that. Try in the social sciences, try to say that you believe in the uniqueness of the institution of male, female, and marriage, and it's being foundational to society. Try to get your paper fairly graded in the social sciences in universities today, or maybe even to get your license when you finally get out. You know, when you think about accreditation and licensure and certification and all the places where this ideology stuff can be leveraged against Christians trying to just serve their neighbors, that's where we're at with a lot of these kind of things. And the 117th Congress just started by saying, we're going to tell you how to speak if you're going to deal with us. And the point is we're pretty much in every aspect of your life. I'm shocked that Christians believe that government will do what God has told us to do as free citizens one to another. You know, we've got to start taking back some of the terminology. I hear all the time, Christian right. Oh, they're politicizing the gospel, and it's terrible, terrible, terrible. But I never hear anybody talk about the Christian left. And look, I work with people who would be considered Christian right in D.C. I work with them. I've never heard them say that they think the government should enforce the gospel. I've never heard that. They have certain moral principles they think are foundational to good government. They come from a Christian worldview. I would say the Christian right has a little bit too much confidence in they think sometimes that the law can transform. We Lutherans know that the law can only curb, and it can only bring us to repentance. So we know the limitation of the law in our lives, and sometimes they're a little bit overzealous on what they think the law can do to transform. But they never have said, in all the time I've been with them, that the gospel is something that should be the purview of the government. Well, we just elected a senator who in his mind, the very gospel of Jesus Christ is political. And we're going to try to unpack that in the weeks to come, because that's going to be a real issue going forward. And it definitely changes the proclamation of the gospel. Status versus free citizens. Left and right, there's left and right versions of statism. And statism is just that one person controls the marketplace. One person controls whether you get this or not. One person creates it, and the rest of us live with it, and I guess we're all happy because we all have the same thing. That's kind of the status view of life. Free citizens, it's a whole different way of thinking about it. Someone asked me one time when I vote, what do I think about? And I think about my friends who are small business owners who've come from all different parts of the world, all different nationalities, and they came here because they could actually start their own businesses, and they could provide for their families, and they could take care of those things, and they didn't need anyone else to do that. They didn't have to go work for a corporation. They didn't have to go work for this, or they didn't have to go work for that. They could do it for themselves. That's the person who's under siege today, because that's the person who doesn't need government, and he only needs family, church, and the protection and the opportunity to do that. And as I've said before, America is the one place where small businesses are the engine of the culture, and I think that's what's under assault. That's who I vote for when I go vote. I don't vote to protect my position in life. I mean, I guess everyone has a little bit of that in them when they vote. I'm more thinking about the kinds of folks that I want to have opportunity. And it can mean people from all walks of life who want to strive to live virtuous lives for the sake of their family and their community. I think that's who we should be thinking about. And then whether we have free moralists, because everybody's a moralist. Everyone has a moral view of life, whether it's free, serving, caring, or whether it's state compelled. And the state will always compel a certain level of morality. Don't get me wrong, I understand that. But when you start having state compel benevolence, then it's not benevolence. And we'll see. There are people who really believe the state will do it, and they're going to be really good. And this is more and more America is moving into that notion that the state will do kind of church things and free society things better than free people. And we will see, because that's kind of where we are. So again, in basically closing this down, I would just say the hard work of rebuilding is upon us in some ways, although the deconstruction is still happening too. We just engaged a summer of rage, destruction, intimidation, and it's a winning strategy. The question is now what's going to be rebuilt in the rubble. And, I think it's always harder to rebuild. The post-Civil War, when you look back in our history, over 500,000 people died in the Civil War, and some of them were fighting for, obviously the Union, but also against slavery. Abolition was part of the process. People gave their lives for it. What happened, though, was after the war, Reconstruction's much harder than just the destruction. They burned Atlanta to the ground. That's easy to do. That ended the war. Sherman's march to the coast. But then how do you rebuild it? And what we found out is there were people that came in and started doing all kinds of things, and then the people who had been defeated started using nefarious ways, getting back at reclaiming their power. And that's where the whole thing about Jim Crow came from. That's where the whole thing, KKK was the army force of the insurrection of the kind of the Confederate bigots reclaiming their position. And so building some back is tough, because freedom it's much harder than just when someone has all the power and tells you what to do. So we're going to talk about those kind of things. And I know a lot of people are even talking about the racial issues right now. If you're talking about these racial issues, I would say you've got to be talking about what's happened to the family because of the public policy. And if you're not talking about that, you're not talking about the solutions. And I really want to know, even with this discussion about disenfranchisement and enfranchisement and all that, how come nobody talked about this in 2008 in Prop 8 in California, where a court literally overturned and disenfranchised Black and Hispanic voters? I've never heard anybody talk about that. And to me, that was Jim Crow in 2008. And so again, we want citizens. I think the goal is free citizens, especially Christian citizens, who can actually be neighbors one to another, even with those we disagree, and kind of learning how we can do that as part of our goal of proclaiming this God who ordered and created us. So a couple of things. The hard work of rebuilding a culture of virtue and civility is part of our mission, and we've got to be that community first. That first thing is, the politics is important, but the first thing is, are we even this to one another? And that's going to be a challenge going forward, because it's going to, even just to proclaim who we are, is going to have some public ramifications. We must bless also those who are trapped in the ideological stuff that's going on in our culture. I think about in Rome, when they actually treated, babies as, unless if the father came and said, this is now my son, fine. If he didn't, they put the baby outside of the city wall, and it died either of exposure or the animals devoured it. Well, what the Christians did is they just started scooping it up. They couldn't change Rome completely, because Rome was the power structure of that time, but they could take care of the things that they couldn't change by actually serving in a way that Rome wouldn't serve. And so we can do that. I think even of Philemon, how Philemon and Onesimus transformed the slave-master relationship without being able to transform Rome's view of it. And again, the Christian West is the culture that got rid of slavery, and yet it's been tarred and feathered with it as if it was the only culture that actually had it. we can talk about how that whole process worked, but we can be Philemons and Onesimuses in the midst of all this no matter what. And we stand at the precipice of identity politics today, and I don't think we fully understand what's coming with that and its challenge to our being able to preach and teach the whole counsel of God. We will talk more about that in the days to come. It is interesting. Martin Luther was castigated by James Cone. I've read pretty much everything James Cone has written. One of the things he actually blames Martin Luther for the peasants being annihilated and for all those kind of things, and he says he sided with the power structure. He was, what typical Christians always have done. He sides with the powerful people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so even Luther is deconstructed or delegitimated when he had nothing to do with the racial stuff that's going on in our culture today. That's going to be the challenge, whether the church can be a legitimate voice in its own culture going forward. And what is it going to mean if there was a new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph? What will that mean for us? So we are people who are sinful people, broken people, just like everybody else. But we do have a message of how God has created and ordered us, and we know kind of the implications of that. The question, will we learn how to serve that back into our culture for the sake of our culture? A couple of other books just to let you know before we go. I love Jonah Goldberg's book, The Tyranny of Cliches. That's the problem, I think. There's so many things we're talking about today. And I say, well, what did you mean by that? And it's really a cliche, and everyone assumes that you know what we're talking about. This is a great book that kind of unpacks that and gives you some power to deal with some of the verbiage that's out there, because, as I said before, most politicians don't want to say what they really mean. Dinesh D'Souza's written some good stuff. One of them's called The Big Lie, and he's talking about, he's got a book on race too that I think is very helpful. And again, I want you to see, the goal of this is to see why government is something that was not meant to be entrusted with the main things of our life, and why the American experiment, at least, is to be credited with that. And then Free to Believe, as always, this is kind of the culture that we want to help rebuild again for everybody who's in America, for the sake of our neighbors. So Happy New Year. I hope these things give you some things to think about. This is just kind of comments in the middle of all the things that are going on right now. We'll start to unpack the new Congress in the days to come. We'll start to unpack, some of the agendas now that I think are going to be unleashed on our culture, and what that means again for us to be church. Religious liberty is going to be an issue, and the goal is not just religious liberty, but are we using that liberty to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ? Because that's the only thing that will save us. So Happy New Year. Hope these thoughts give you some perspective, and until we see Jesus Christ face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace, but be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, I'm Gregory Stelz. Have a great day.